Hello, Bookmans universe, and thank you for tuning in. Today we are with a very special guest, Luen Yang. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Gene and I'm a cartoonist, so I write and draw comic books and graphic novels.
Which is
Very cool. Very cool. Among other many other talents, I'm sure.
Not
Alrighty.
much, I gotta be honest. I don't think I'm very good at very many things. I was just talking to my wife about this, actually. We had a hard time coming up with like five things that I'm decent at. But we can talk about that later.
I was having a similar conversation with my husband. We were like joking about making like a commune style community, and I was realizing that I'm the only one that doesn't have a handy skill base.
Yeah.
I'm like, you want your
Yeah.
social media around? I got you.
Yeah, like if COVID turns into zombies, I'm done. No one's
Yeah,
gonna
pretty
want me
much.
in their village.
Like I'll be able to like take zombies down with like literature.
Yeah. I know.
So, Gene, other than the obvious, the glorious Avatar: The Last Airbender series, what have you worked on? What are the projects that you have created?
Well, I've done a bunch of books with First Second Books, which is one of my publishers. Anything where like I come up with the story, I come up with the world, I come up with the characters, I do with them. But in addition to that, I have worked in the Avatar universe, the DC universe, and now the Marvel universe. I just started working for Marvel a few months ago.
That's so
Super
amazing.
exciting. Yeah, like personally, like congratulations on Shang-Chi. That's really, really cool. The miniseries was absolutely amazing. So I'm absolutely excited for it to be continuing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun to do. It was like this, it was just a super fun creative team that Marvel put together. It was almost everybody was a part of the Chinese diaspora. So, I'm a Chinese American. The editor is a Chinese American living in New York. And then the artist is a Chinese Italian. And another artist was a Chinese Filipino. And then I think the colorist is Chinese Canadian, I want to say. But it was like it was fun. It was fun to get
That's
everybody
super
together.
fun. Well, I actually had a question about that, about your work with Marvel. Like, what is it like to bring a character to life that maybe not a lot of people know about because he's not typically a part of like the Avenger franchise as MCU has presented it so far, and now we have the movie
Yeah.
coming out, and the like, he's becoming an ongoing character that with your line. So, what is it like really bringing this character to life in a new way?
Yeah, it's interesting. This was kind of the first conversation that I had with my editor, with Darren Shan at Marvel. Both of us are Chinese American. Neither of us were big Shang-Chi fans when we were kids. I specifically remember going to my local comic book store and avoiding the Shang-Chi comics because I hadn't worked through stuff yet. I was still feeling not super comfortable in my own skin as a Chinese American. So I didn't want to be like the Asian kid that picks up the comic with the Asian character in it you know
Yeah.
so this with this series that we're doing now, it was a mini series, and now we're going to get to continue it as an ongoing. We really saw it as a way of like kind of working through Shang-Chi and working through our own stuff too in the meantime. Shang-Chi has always been kind of like I don't even think it was B-list. He was like a C-list character in the Marvel universe, right? But with the announcement of the movie, he kind of suddenly catapulted into some attention. And if you look into his history, it's this combination of good and bad. Like they're just aspects of his origin that would not fly today in
Right.
2021. So he started off as like Fu Manchu's son. And I would say that the big thing when we looked at these old Shang-Chi comics is I think his appeal came from the fact that he was this other. Like his appeal was like I think there are other characters in his stories that you were meant to identify with. And for Shang-Chi himself, you were meant to look at him. He was like this weird guy from China who did all these really amazing martial arts
Yeah, like
feats.
I know from my experience with Shang-Chi, like growing up at, like also as an Asian American, is like one, I didn't really want to read those comics either because of being an Asian American. I was like
Yeah.
kind of very much staying away from that as well. But he very much was just like he was the kung fu character. So it was
Yeah.
like if you wanted to watch kung fu, I did that. That wasn't what I wanted to do at that point. Like I wanted to read something else. So I totally.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right. You were just watching him, right? You were supposed to look at him. As opposed to I feel like a lot of Marvel is defined by you're supposed to imagine yourself as the character, right? Like Spider-Man, I kind of think you're supposed to identify with the character. That's why they show him doing his laundry. You know, they show him having money problems. They show him fighting with Aunt May and having trouble at work. All of that is meant for you to identify with Spider-Man. But Shang-Chi is like this whole other thing. Shang-Chi is like you're meant to look at him and not necessarily want to be him.
Right.
But we're trying to write him in a way that makes him a character that you identify with.
Awesome. How would you best describe him to people who don't know anything about the character?
Well, the way we're framing it is he grew up in a cult. He grew up in this cult that is like it's run by his supervillain father, Zhang Zhu. So the Fu Manchu character kind of became Zhang Zhu after Marvel gave up the Fu Manchu license. Fu Manchu wasn't Marvel's character, and this cult kind of conducted itself like the Qing dynasty never fell. So they kind of live and dress the way they did in China in the late 1800s, and he kind of has to break out of that. Ultimately, the story is really about family. Like he comes from a really dysfunctional family to the point where they're a cult, right? Like his family's a cult. But our first initial story was about him reconnecting with his brothers and sisters and trying to figure out his place, trying to reconcile himself with his family and with his place in the world.
That's really awesome.
It's amazing. So, you know, based off of your experience within the graphic novel and comic book industry, you know, they do play a huge role in, you know, the growth and development of children and young adults. In your eyes, how have you seen that early development happen, and what impacts the comics and stuff have had on those ages?
It's been really neat to see this. When I was a kid in the 80s, you know, if you look at a class of 30 kids, maybe 4 or 5 of them at most would read comics, right? 4 or 5 of them would go to the local comic book shop and buy comics. But nowadays, before pandemic, when I got to do classroom visits, in a class of 30 kids, all 30 kids would read comics, right? They would read comics of some form. Most of them, almost all of them would have read like Raina Telgemeier stuff or Jeff Smith's Bone. But everybody in that classroom reads comics. It's neat. It's really neat to see as a longtime comic book fan. And I think a lot of that change comes from the this mind shift that has happened with educators and with librarians. Librarians back in the 1950s, especially here in America, were comic books enemy. Like they were very, very anti-comics. And then starting in the 80s all the way until now, librarians have become the graphic novel format's greatest advocate. You know, they really have been pushing it. And I think it's because first they recognize that it is reading, right? It's like graphic novels are just another publishing format sitting alongside narrative poetry and prose, everything else that we have. And second is, I think in a visual world, graphic novels offer lots of different opportunities. Graphic novels offer this opportunity to learn about visual literacy, to learn how to interpret the things that we see. So librarians have embraced it, and more I'm seeing like teachers at all levels, K-12, you know, higher education, have been really using graphic novels in their classrooms.
And
I wouldn't have guessed this at all. Like if you had told me that it would be like this like 20 years ago, I would have thought you were lying.
I mean, a lot of the times it's just kids need that one book or, you know, one piece of art that they can hinge onto to get that fire going and, you know, start their love of any sort of fandom or passion. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
As a storytelling medium, how do comics differ from books or movies?
I mean, so books are like prose books are don't feature any sort of visuals in them. I think that's the big difference, right? Or the visuals don't carry as much narrative responsibility. Like you can have pictures illustrating a prose novel, but usually if you pull those pictures out or you even replace them with pictures drawn by another artist, it doesn't significantly change the meaning of the book. Whereas with the graphic novel, if you change the artist out and replace all the visuals, it's going to change the book in a very fundamental way. That said, I don't think that one publishing format is necessarily better than the other. I
Mhm.
think graphic novels and prose novels, each of them, like, they have different strengths and weaknesses, you know, and there's certain stories that are just best told through certain media. Or sometimes if you want to translate, like if you want to translate a prose story into graphic novel format, I think you have to be really careful, right? You sometimes have to change that story to leverage the strengths of one medium over the other. Now, in terms of movies, movies are visual, obviously, but I think the big difference between movies and graphic novels is that movies are time bound, you know, whereas graphic novels aren't. Graphic novels, time doesn't totally exist. So with the movie, the pace of the storytelling actually happens at a rate that's determined by the creators, like the directors and his team and their team. They decide how fast that movie goes. With a graphic novel, the rate is determined by the reader. Like if a reader wants to slow the story down, she totally can. She can just read those passages slower, right? And if a reader wants to speed it up, she totally can do that as well.
Actually, I haven't thought of it like that before. That's a really interesting way of framing that. Especially as someone who is like a giant like graphic novel reader, I'm like, oh no, that's exactly how I read it.
Uh,
That is exactly how I would handle it.
Okay, you got some more questions?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to keep talking about like your work, especially with the Library of Congress, as an advocate of young readers and stuff like that, there are a bunch of different programs that you've worked with before, like Reading Without Walls, and then I believe now you are a part of the DC Young Readers program and like the DC Kids Camp. Can you tell us
yeah,
about
yeah. So the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature is this position that was created by the Library of Congress, and every child, the reader, and the Children's Book Council. It hasn't been running for super long, so I was the fifth one. Every ambassador gets a 2-year stint. Right now, it's Jason Reynolds, who is amazing. I'm actually really sad. Like one of the big things that the National Ambassador does is we travel to different communities to talk about the importance of reading and the importance of books. And Jason's been able to do that virtually, but Jason in person is different from Jason in the screen. He has like this totally different energy, and I'm kind of sad that like all these communities missed out on that. You know, I'm sure he was scheduled to go all over, and he hasn't been able to. But in any case, every ambassador gets to pick a platform that they want to talk about. For me, it was Reading Without Walls, which was just a way of getting kids to explore the world through books, you know, to read books that they wouldn't normally read. And the way we framed it is as a challenge. So you do the challenge either as an individual or as a community. You just set a due date for yourself, and by that due date, you do one of three things. One, you can read a book about a character who doesn't look like you or live like you. Two, you read a book about a topic that you might not know anything about, that you might even find intimidating. And three, you read a book in a format that you don't normally read for fun. So if normally all you read are novels for fun, I want you to try a graphic novel. If normally all you read are comic books and graphic novels, I want you to try something without any pictures in it. So it was fun. It was great to do. Libraries and classrooms and bookstores all over ran the challenge with their communities. And what we heard was a lot of folks were able to get books to move that didn't normally move in their bookstores or in their libraries.
That's
And I
awesome.
thought that was exactly what we were going after.
Yeah, that's great.
That is so cool.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of like reading books that you wouldn't typically have picked up, like growing up Asian American and in a primarily like white area, I really wish that I had had a book like American Born Chinese as a kid, because that didn't come out until I was much older. And the book, the way it deals with racial bullying, did you actually pull those from personal experiences, or were those kind of stories that you were telling for the people as well?
No, that was from my own childhood.
Yeah.
I don't think it was. I don't think it was. It was pretty typical, right? I feel like if you talk to any Asian person, at least who grew up in like the 80s or 90s, I think you're gonna just hear the same stories over and over again.
Yeah, like I felt a lot of that reading it for the first time, going, oh no, this is exactly what I experienced as well.
Yeah, bullies are not super creative. I feel
No,
like they
they're
all
not.
have like the same playbook. You know what I mean? With the same taunts.
Mhm. Well, it's like in talking about American Born Chinese, Chin Ki, the cousin, going from the bullying into this kind of like negative stereotypical character of an Asian person. Like, the way I read that was it was supposed to be very much like in your face of being this negative connotation of Asians. Was that how you meant to present it as?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I kind of thought of drawing the Cousin Chinky chapters as like almost like an exorcism, like all this stuff that I kind of internalized, I wanted to put on the page so I could deal with it. And Cousin Chinky really is, I was trying to be as over the top as I could with that character. Exactly for that reason. Like I wanted to take off his head at the end, which I got to do, but I also wanted to deal with him very directly and explicitly on the page.
Yeah, I at first reading reading Chinky, you're like a little like put off because you're like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not supposed to like this is like I'm not supposed to be like this. And then you're like, I kind of realized the farther I got in, I was like, oh no, this is on purpose. Like this is really just to bring it to the forefront and like show how offensive this is.
Yeah. I'm glad you had that reaction of like I
definitely very visceral at first of going like, oh,
that's great. I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Yeah. Sometimes people ask me, oh, I think it's funny, but I feel really weird about laughing at him. I feel really uncomfortable laughing at him, and I think that's fine too. That's kind of what I was going for, because I think like Americans, we have a lot of race-based humor. Like if you listen to any stand-up comedian, almost always they'll have like some kind of race-based set. And I think there are two different ways of making jokes about race. One, you make jokes about race because you think that the racist ideas themselves are laughable. And that's kind of what I was going for with Cousin Chinky. And the second way is you laugh at the race-based jokes because you think they're true, which I think is heinous. But for Cousin Chinky, I definitely was going for that first way. Every now and then, though, I feel like I meet somebody who might interpret it wrong, and it always makes me feel so uncomfortable. It seems rare now,
I'm
but
glad that I interpret it correctly. It was also part of me being like, I shouldn't be laughing at this character at all.
Yeah. Well,
I know James is probably wanting to ask some Atla questions.
Of course. First, yeah, of course. First, I do want to touch on censorship. So, I don't know if you've ever been to a Bookmans before. We are wonderful.
I don't think I have. Yeah, I'm sure you're wonderful.
You gotta.
Yeah, as soon as everything gets back to normal.
Of course.
Yeah.
So one of our big core values is we believe, you should read what you want to read. You should read it how you want to read it. And, you should consume whatever media that you want to consume. We are very, very much pro anti-censorship. And it's always an interesting question for me to ask, creators of any kind of what kinds of censorships have you seen within your industry, especially in regards to like how people might view graphic novels as, not a valid form of media. You touched on it a little bit before, but I'm sure it's evolved a lot over the years, but could you give us your words on that?
Yeah, I do think that comic books and graphic novels can, in certain communities, in certain cases, be more vulnerable than prose books, just because of the visual nature, right? Like that's one of the powers of the image, is that it can give you these very, very visceral images, but that also makes them a little bit more prone to being censored. For me personally, I do feel like I've had some experience with censorship. Like there are certain communities where there have been efforts to get American Born Chinese pulled off the shelves, and it's because of what we were just talking about. It's because of the Cousin Chinky character. I kind of get it. Like I feel like the people who want that, there's a part of me that definitely sympathizes with them. I understand, like I'm playing with images. Like it's basically, I took the things that hurt me when I was a kid and I stuck them on the page, right? So if you're just flipping through it, I get it. I get why like you would be hurt or offended by it. But at the same time, I feel like I'm using satire. Like I remember reading A Modest Proposal when I was a senior in high school as part of our class assignment and being kind of blown away by it, right? And American Born Chinese, especially the Cousin Chinky chapters, I do feel like I was trying to get at things in the same way. So if you censor that, right? If you're like you can't talk about like people of color can't talk about the stereotypes that they have to deal with on a daily basis in visual form, then what you're doing is you're taking satire and you're regulating it to the dominant culture. You're saying only the dominant culture gets to use this particular literary form, which seems kind of heinous, right? That's not a good thing. So even though I do feel a certain amount of sympathy for the people who have asked for it, I think ultimately we do have to land on the side that Bookmans has landed on, that you have to be against censorship. And I do have friends too. I have cartoonist friends and comic book creator friends who have had it much worse. Like Mariko Tamaki, she's a good friend of mine. And a lot of her stuff is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It comes from a human place. Like I feel like when you read a Mariko Tamaki story, you come away a more empathetic person. But sometimes simply because she's writing about her own experience as a lesbian woman, like even her fiction comes out of that she faces censorship, and I think it's too bad. I feel like it's more than too bad. It's wrong, right? It's wrong. Like voices like Mariko's need to be out there because they make our world a more humane place.
I totally agree with that, and especially bringing up Mariko Tamaki. Like this one summer is like one of like my most recommended graphic novels that I always like recommend to people. Like it's absolutely stunning, beautiful to read, great story. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a story that you can go back to over and over and over again and get something.
It's really poignant and personal, and I just love that about it.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
But going on what you guys were talking about censorship, Superman Smashes the Klan. That if I don't know if James has read it, but it's your latest release with DC, and I think it was released right after Dragon Hoops, right?
Yeah. I didn't mean for that to happen. I just ran super late on Dragon Hoops. I missed like a billion deadlines. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to have 2 books released.
2 books at the same time.
Yeah.
But kind of talking about like the censorship, like Superman Smashes the Klan it was based off the 1940s radio show of Superman, and bringing that to light, given our current political and social challenges that we're having in the country right now. What was that really like addressing a story with so much racial bigotry, and then having to kind of run that line of censorship?
Yeah, I'm really glad that DC Comics said yes. I had a meeting with Marie Javins. She's now the head of DC Comics, but at the time she was I think she was an executive editor, and she said yes. Like I brought it up and she said yes. That's a story that I've been thinking about for a very long time. So Superman Smashes the Klan is actually a retelling of one of the most famous Superman stories in the history of Superman. Back in 1946. On his radio show, he actually went up against the Klan. And at the time, it was seen as this very risky move because back then, the Klan wasn't necessarily seen as a terrorist organization in all of America. There are certain pockets of America that saw him as like a community group, like a community morals group. So the writers' room knew that if they did this, if they had the Man of Steel go up against these hooded racists, that they were going to get some pushback. So they did. They ended up getting death threats and calls for boycott, but they still did it. And I was always really inspired by that courage, that they were willing to do something like that. And ultimately it had this great effect. By the time those 16 episodes of that storyline ran, the real life Klan actually saw a dip in their membership because nobody wanted to join. Nobody wants to be Superman's enemy.
Right. No one wants to be cast as a villain in a comic book.
Yeah, that's right. So I always wanted to, like that story's never been told in comics, and I wanted to do it. So I asked Gurihiru. They actually did the Avatar comics with me. They're the artists that did the Avatar comics with me, if they'd be willing to work with me, and they said yes, and we were able to do it. I think it did feel tricky. Some of the trickiness came from the fact that we were adapting this really, really old thing, and they're just plot points that don't work for a modern audience. Like there's this one scene in the original where Perry White and Jimmy Olsen are about to get tarred and feathered by Klansmen, and then it ends like that's where the cliffhanger is. And in the next episode, the Klansmen are like, oh no, we forgot the tar. Who was in charge of buying the tar? And you can't do that. You can't do that in 2021. No one's going to be like, oh, that works. But there are also other pieces that totally work. Like all of the bones, I think, of the story totally work. So we kept all the bones, but we changed some of the other stuff. Like another thing that didn't really work was they had a Chinese American family at the center of it, and the Chinese American family was a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. The father and the son were the only ones with speaking parts, and we never hear from the mom and the daughter, right? We only know about them because they're mentioned in the dialogue, but we never actually hear their voices, and that's just such a, like, even now listening to that radio show, it feels like such a glaring gap that
Yeah.
we wanted to fill that in. So we made the daughter one of the main characters of our version.
Nice.
That seems really cool to be able to modernize that.
Yeah. But it was disconcerting looking at that, seeing how much of it is still relevant, right? It's been so long, decades and decades and decades, and that some of that stuff is still, it could have been written yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's what made it so poignant to me, is that like it literally, you could have looked at it since January and gone, oh yeah, that's a thing that happened.
Yeah, exactly. January. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is it like? I mean, I know that you left your teaching job to go to DC, and I think I can speak for most comic book nerds that that's the dream. Like that's absolutely like what all of us would love to do, is go, yeah, I'm just gonna leave here and go, write my favorite superhero. And I'm not gonna ask you who your favorite actual DC character is, because that's probably like a big faux pas when you're writing a specific one. But what is it like with the new series that you have for Superman? What is it like writing a character that is so beloved and so well known? Like, this is an origin story that a lot of the community is extremely familiar with, even if you don't like Superman. So what is it like taking a very prominent character and adding a little bit of your own personality and twist into it?
Yeah, it's super nerve-wracking, so when I first signed on to do to write for DC, I did have a lot of trouble leaving my day job. I really loved being a part of a school community. I loved being a teacher. I loved having my own classroom. So it was really hard to leave. But after leaving, I was just, it was kind of this mix of giddiness and like complete fear. So I did 10 issues on the main Superman title, like the monthly title, and I feel like I just kind of stumbled through it. Like I was learning a lot. I was working with Greg Pak, who is he's probably most well known as a Marvel writer. So he wrote like Hulk for a really, really long time. He wrote this epic called World War Hulk that people still talk about today. But he was on another Superman book, so he kind of walked me through it. He's like a veteran comic book writer. And I feel like during those 10 issues, I was trying to, learn the ropes. When I got to Superman Smashes the Klan, especially since it's part of the young reader line, I did feel like I got more elbow room, and it was a little bit easier to write. And I felt like I could explore the parts of Superman that I've always wanted to figure out. Like the fact that he's an immigrant, right? I always wanted to do a story where that was the focus. And it felt good. It felt great to finally get to do that with Superman Smashes the Klan.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Shall we dig into some Atla?
Sure.
Yay!
James is like, I'm here for Last Airbender.
Yeah. Wait, can I ask James a question? James, like, how did you come to it? How did you come to Avatar: Last Airbender? Were you watching it when it was airing, or was it later, or when?
So I grew up watching the show. It was one of my favorite shows as a kid. I have since then watched it around 5 or 6 times, all the way through. And only actually within the last year, I discovered these delightful things. And I mean, they're one of my favorite reads, of course. Just to brush up on everything, I started reading them. And I only got about halfway through the search, sadly, because I'm not a very fast reader, but it brought so many memories back. So let's start off this with a little question. If you were a bender, what would you bend?
Oh, I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about this so much. Okay, and I think I would want to be an earthbender.
Okay.
Because all the other elements, after you're done bending them, they kind of go back to normal, right? Like
Sure.
If you're bending water, it just kind of goes back to normal water. If you're bending air, it just kind of goes back to normal air. And even fire just kind of goes back to normal fire. But earth, you could do something crazy and it stays in that shape indefinitely. and I've always liked that. I guess I
That's
like.
your inner creative mind talking right there.
Yeah. Do you have an answer? Which one would you be?
Airbender, no
Airbender.
questions asked. Yeah.
Airbender.
Because
Yeah.
I love villains so much. I'm always bending towards fire.
Fire.
Our whole department is huge Avatar: The Last Airbender fans. We actually before the pandemic hit, we actually were all planning for Comic-Con to dress up as our favorite characters from the show.
Oh, that's so great.
So James is going to be the cabbage guy.
Yeah, yeah.
I was
That's
going to
awesome.
be Azula, and then our other coworker was going to be Appa.
Wow, that's so great.
So we were just kind of all across the board.
Yeah, yeah.
So tell us about your experience with Dark Horse Comics.
Oh, it was a ton of fun. It was great. They called me up. I was shocked that they were offering me the chance to write Avatar: The Last Airbender, because at that point I was a huge fan of it, right? Like I actually first heard about it in my classroom. So I was a computer science teacher, and during labs, when my students were supposed to be working on the projects, they'd be talking about the show on Nickelodeon. They'd be talking about Avatar. You know, they'd be like, "Who do you think Aang is going to end up with? Who do you think is going to be his earthbending teacher?" All this stuff, and it sounded awesome. But I was a teacher, so I couldn't actually join into the conversation. I just had to tell them to get back to work. So eventually I had a friend who had it on DVD and he loaned it to me, and I watched it with my wife. My wife generally hates comic books, or not comic books. She hates cartoons generally, like cartoon shows. She generally has no patience for, but she loved Avatar. Like I think she even loved it a little bit more than me. Like it'd be 1 a.m, you know? And we would have just finished like 5 episodes. She'd be like, "Oh, just one more. And we would do it. We would watch one more. So I was a big fan. When Dark Horse called me up, I jumped at the chance to do it. The very first conversation I had with Mike and Brian, the 2 creators of the show, I just asked what any fan would ask, right? Like I don't even think I said hi. I just said, "So what happened to Zuko's mom?" Right?
First question I would ask too.
Yeah, right. Like even before the hellos, just what happened to Zuko's mom? And it was kind of crazy that I got to do the story that kind of answers that question in the search.
How much creative, how much did they allow you to input into the story, and like were you fully a part of how the story evolved and whatnot? Or
Yeah, I really felt like my experience on Avatar was like this perfect balance. So I signed on right after Korra had been announced. So they've been working on Korra for a long time, and they just gotten all the major pieces figured out. Like they figured out that there was going to be Republic City that grew out of these Fire Nation colonies. They figured out that Aang and Katara were going to get married and have 3 kids. All these big pieces had been figured out, right? But within that, I felt like I still had a good amount of creative elbow room. I felt like every single book that we did started with a conversation between me and Mike and Brian, and we just talked. We talked for like an hour, and after that, I wrote an outline. I sent it to them. They gave me notes. We did that for a few rounds, and then I would move into the script. And they were there every step of the way, but it was always to make sure that we were staying true to the voice of the series, not for anything else. So I felt like it was a great balance between the two.
that's amazing. I'm sure Kay and I, I can speak for Kay here. We are so jealous of you.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was so fun to do.
And I do want to just say, I am so impressed with, reading through the promise again, just how much you incorporated with like actual history that happened, like with the harmony and restoration movement in the promise for the, all the movements in China during the 1800s and early 1900s. It's so refreshing to, be able to relate something so wonderful to things that happened in history, and they are still so relevant today to learn about and to talk about. So that's really awesome.
Well, thank you. I mean, I was following the example of the show, right? They did so much homework to do that show. And I think like you only see the tip of the iceberg on the actual show, but they did like hours and hours and hours of homework and research.
So cool. So what do you have an episode that you could watch like as a short film over and over and over again?
Yeah, it's either the Guru or the Beach. Like
Okay.
the Beach just blew me away. right? Like both of those
I can
episodes did, right? Both of those episodes. I feel like the beach especially, the way it changes how you see Azula or all of those characters in fundamental ways. And it makes it so that like you watch that show or you watch that episode and then you go back and watch the episodes that came before and you see them in totally different ways. And I thought that was so brilliant.
That was
Yeah,
a
and then
favorite episode for the same reason.
yeah, and then the guru too. I feel like it shows um uh Aang at his most fundamental. Like that show just shows who he is.
That's for sure. So my last question, and then I will stop bothering you about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Whose idea was it to make Iroh invent the pearl milk tea? I have to know.
Yeah, I did pitch that, and they're like, yeah, sure, let's run with it, because he's the tea guy, right? He's the tea
Of course.
guy. So
made me chuckle. I love that.
That's really funny.
Yeah. All right, Kay, do you want to move on to some other of the stuff?
Yeah, I mean, James, I feel like while we have Gene here, if you love all the history that's in Avatar, you have to read Boxer and Saint.
It sounds like I definitely do.
Literally all history. It's amazing.
Love that.
But the last thing I wanted to talk about is Dragon Hoops, which is your last title, other than Superman. And one of my things is that like while American Born Chinese was super personal, you actually included yourself as a character in Dragon Hoops. Was there any difficulty in doing that as a storyteller?
yeah, I wasn't planning on doing it. When I first proposed the book, I told my publisher that I was just going to focus on the team. It was going to be about these coaches and these players. I wasn't planning on being in it at all. But then as I got into it, like as I was following the team and writing down notes, I realized that I had to put myself in there because I had to be real about my own weaknesses as a storyteller. Like one, I didn't know much about basketball. I felt like I had to admit that to the reader. And then second, I felt like they're just parts of like some of the players on that team. I didn't have a lot of overlap with their childhood experiences. So I was a kid that grew up in the suburbs. I was a child of immigrants, and there were kids on that team that were like that, like Arinze, who one of the chapters is on. He's like the child of a Nigerian immigrant. He grew up in the suburbs, and I felt like he and I connected. Like he's one of the kids that I'm still in touch with. I feel like he and I connected really well. He's not a kid anymore either. He's like in his 20s now, which is really weird. But some of the other kids, like they grew up in the flatlands of Oakland. They had really different childhood experiences than I did, and I felt like I had to be real about that as well. That I had certain blind spots, especially when it came to them. And the best way to do that would be to just put myself in the book, and that's what ended up happening.
Well, as someone who has proclaimed on the first page of the book that you don't like sports, what other than being a teacher at Bishop O'Dowd at the time, what was the interest that brought you to wanting to write this book about the basketball team?
Yeah, well, first, basketball was invading my life a little bit, right? It was like part of it was being on that campus, and at the beginning of that year, there's just a lot of excitement around this team. But even beyond that, I have 4 kids. Our oldest is 17 years old now. But when he was in 5th grade, he joined his school's basketball team. So I started having to go to these games, and I had to watch him play, and I had to kind of understand what the rules were, right? And then the Jeremy Lin thing happened as well around that time. I watched him. I was fascinated. I couldn't understand why I cared. Like,
well, we're all supposed to care about Jeremy Lin.
Yeah, yeah, but I
care about him.
I didn't know why though. Like he's dribbling a ball on a court. Like what's the big deal? But I felt it, like I couldn't understand it with my brain, but I felt it like in my heart. I felt like, oh, this is a big deal, but I couldn't understand why. So all this stuff, and then books came out too. Like Kwame Alexander's book came out, and it kind of blew my mind. Crossover. So I got a little more interested in basketball.
Well, Dragon Hoops takes us on a journey of the team season and the history of the sport, and then your relationship and understanding of kind of both at the same time in this whole learning experience. And it's especially towards the end of your teaching career. Looking back on the story that you wrote and like your personal journey during the time, what do you think is like the most important lesson that you learned from following the team?
I mean, what I got from following that team was I felt like I was learning a lesson on courage, you know, because I wasn't an athlete when I was a kid. I never really thought about how much courage it takes to be like a teenager and step out onto a court in front of a giant audience. Some of those games that we played were televised. They were on ESPN. And for these like, and the youngest kid on that team was 14 years old. So to be like a 14-year-old stepping out onto a court on ESPN, that's terrifying, but they were still able to do it. I think the most terrifying part though was the fact that you couldn't be sure what was going to happen in the end. With a superhero comic, you know who's going to win at the end. With a sports like a event, you have no idea. But they did it anyways. They just stepped out over and over and over again anyways. You know, I talk about this in the book, but I got the offer to write Superman in the middle of that season. That was actually the third time that DC Comics had approached me to work for them. And I turned them down the first 2 times, in part because I was kind of like, I liked being a teacher and I was afraid to leave that environment. I don't know what I would have said to that offer had I not been following the team at the time.
Do you think it was a little bit of watching these teenagers go out there and do something courageous that then pushed you into doing something
Yeah.
in your life as well?
Yeah, exactly.
That's really awesome. I'm speaking as a former like athlete, like a child athlete, I guess, or a teenage athlete. Like there is like a certain amount of like, you kind of go on. I think you kind of talk about this in the book too, where it's like they go on and they're one type of person. They're off the court, they're completely different. And that's something also that I really like understood with the book as well. And speaking about these, like these are your students that you're writing about. Was there at any point did you have any like super difficulty like bringing their actual story into the book because these were kids that you were familiar with?
All of it, the whole community, like the coaches, and I talk about in the book how the program itself has this like checkered past, right? If it was fiction, I would just be able to clean it all up and present it as this nice clean thing. But because it's not, I couldn't do that, and that was a struggle all the way through. I think with the kids, I wanted to be mindful that they were minors. I wanted to only share what they were comfortable sharing through the book, and I also wanted to keep the tension, right? I wanted to keep the tension alive all the way through. So sometimes those things were at odds with each other, but I felt like I wanted to make the dignity of the kids the kind of paramount. Like I wanted to put that above everything else. So ultimately, when it came out, they were all really supportive. We did this event together in like a virtual event through the school, and it went really well. They're all in their 20s now, so they're all. That's how long it took me to do that book. They like became adults. They became adults. But it was great. It ended up being this really great experience.
That's awesome. Well, I love the book. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Because basketball happened to be, I played softball, but basketball is my favorite sport. So it was
awesome.
I learned a ton that I didn't even know about the history of basketball. Or I was like, oh, this is awesome. I didn't know that. That's cool. I didn't know this was a woman. What? Like it was a really, really fun, and it was really interesting watching from your perspective of like, I don't know any of this.
Yeah, I don't know.
I really appreciate it because it was kind of like when I watched sports with my husband, and he just goes, I don't know.
Yeah.
Very, very similar. But
That's great.
Current day, I mean, obviously with the pandemic and things, sports are a little hard right now. But what's your relationship with basketball now?
Yeah. Well, I'm still in touch with Coach Lou. We text periodically. We text a decent amount, actually. He just texted me today. So I follow what he's doing. He has not been able to start his team up yet. And I do follow the NBA. It has been harder since the pandemic. I was following them more closely before. But I do follow the NBA. You know, I'm a Bay Area guy, so I'm supposed to follow the Warriors.
I was like, are you a Warriors fan?
Yeah, yeah, I was. I feel like they made all these trades, and I don't know who's on the team anymore. You know what I mean? Like,
no, I'm actually feeling that the other day. I was like, Chris Paul's on the Suns?
Exactly. Like everybody just kind of traded uniforms. Yeah.
And I follow the Warriors because I'm a giant Steve Kerr fan.
Okay.
We were at the University of Arizona here. He played for us, so we follow our boys. But yeah, I mean that's unless there's anything else you want to add about Dragon Hoops, that's what I got for you.
Well, thank you for reading it. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
thank you.
Fantastic. I definitely like the moment I saw it, I was like, it's about basketball. yeah.
So, do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on that you feel inclined to tell our audience?
Yeah, right now the only two things that have been announced are 2 monthly series. So I'm doing the Shang-Chi monthly series with Marvel. The very first issue will come out in May in time for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And then the other one is Batman Superman for DC Comics. I'm taking over with issue number 16, which comes out later this month.
Very cool.
All right, and so our last question for you is, where can our followers follow you?
Well, I am on I'm at Luen Yang. That's my handle on Instagram and on Twitter, on Facebook, and I also have that as a URL. So if you go to jeanluenyang.com, that's my website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, James. Thank you, Kay. Thank you. That was super fun. Thank you.